C13 NMR is really useful to figure out how many carbons are in a given molecule and how many carbons occupy each environment within that molecule, and that's one of the primary uses of C13 NMR, just how many. But to the extent that there's other valuable information present in a carbon NMR, the most valuable piece of it is what kinds of environments do you have? And the way you figure that out is chemical shift. This is one of those topics that you just simply need to memorize. There are detailed tables in any organic textbook that you want to look at, and that will allow you to be very precise with things. But that's not the part that you need to memorize. What you need to memorize instead are relatively large categories, what I like to call magic numbers. If you have certain magic numbers locked away, then you have a feel for what the sort of parameters are, and anything new that you see, you can kind of slot into your mental framework already. It's a way of creating a good way of thinking, a good way of approaching C13 NMR problem solving. So you need to memorize some stuff, and then you need to do enough problems so that all of those memories start linking together and you have some good neural connections, and so you can figure it all out. But again, you need to start by memorizing the key magic numbers. So what is the best way to memorize something that's relatively unfamiliar to you? Well, part of it's obvious. You obviously need to learn the stuff, right? But the part that may not be obvious to you is one of the very best things that you can do in order to memorize something new is to actually pre-test yourself. And what I mean by that is, right now, you know nothing about chemical shift, or very little, or perhaps you've done some reading in the textbook or whatever. But as early in the process as you can, you simply need to take some guesses. Why? Because it'll prime you to learn fresh. So you will have some context already established. You will start creating that neural framework for all of the numbers to fit into, as long as you pre-test yourself. So right now, knowing almost nothing about C13 NMR, stop, take a look at the functional groups that I'm going to list in just a second, pause the video, and then go ahead and populate this line. So what I have in front of me is the range of chemical shifts that are normal for C13 NMR. They go basically from 0 parts per million to basically 220, give or take. And this is more or less an energy axis. It's kind of more related to frequency than anything else, but it's really kind of about the underlying energies. So that's all you know. I'm going to show you the functional groups. Right then, go ahead and pause the video, and then go ahead and throw them down on this number line as best you can. Then, learn what my answers are, and then get a blank sheet of paper out and test yourself. Try to recreate what you just saw. And again, without trying to memorize it very hard, just try it first, listen to what I have to say, then straight up, right there, just boom. Blank sheet of paper, try again. And it's going to reveal to you the kinds of things that are easy for you to store away, and it will reveal to you what's hard. So then you correct yourself. And then you practice a little bit, and then you test again. Said another way, the process is, first you pre-test yourself just to provide some context in which you're going to learn the rest of this. And then after you've learned it, immediately test yourself, fix it, go back and relearn it, and just keep going around until you have it. This is by far the fastest and easiest way to memorize stuff. Okay, so right here is the list of things that I'm going to use to populate my little chemical shift number line. These are the magic numbers that I'm going to want you to store away. We have a methyl group. We have a carbon that's next to an oxygen, which is going to be a stand-in, of course, for a carbon next to some electronegative thing. We have a sort of isolated double bond sort of thing. We have a aromatic ring, sort of double bonds all linked together sort of thing. We have a carbonyl that has an oxygen nearby, so think ester or acid. We have a carbonyl where I haven't specified that there's an electronegative group out there, so you don't know what's there, probably some carbon. We have chloroform, and I've put this in red as opposed to these green ones because this is a standard NMR solvent, and so memorizing where exactly this comes is going to be useful. And likewise, TMS is something that's often found in a C13 NMR, so you should memorize exactly where it shows up. Anyway, go ahead, populate the number line, pause the video right now. Alright, so the most important thing to label on the chart right away, right at the beginning, is actually going to be the CDCl3, and it will always show up as a 3-line pattern right at 77.16. So this is the key thing to keep in mind. If you see a 3-line pattern right at 77.16, or close enough, this needs to be referenced to 77.16, and it is in fact the solvent for your C13 NMR. This, by the way, is also telling you something. This carbon is bound to 3 electronegative electronegative groups, and it's showing up at 77-ish. Okay, meanwhile, TMS is the other one that you really need to have stored away, and it's relatively straightforward. It shows up at 0 exactly. We have defined TMS, tetramethylsilane, to show up at 0 exactly. So again, just memorize that. So the two magic numbers that you're going to see all the time that are impurities and you can ignore, CDCl3 at 77.16 and TMS right at 0. On to the key compounds. Your boring methyl sort of thing is going to show up here right between, 10 and 20, maybe 25 or so. Your OR is going to show up, generally speaking, between 90 and 50 or thereabouts. So this is going to be a carbon that's next to an electronegative atom, something like that. Between 100 and 150 is where you're going to see both your actual isolated double bond as well as your aromatic regions. So again, that's between 100 and 150. That's generally where your sp2 hybridized carbons show up. Your relatively electronegative atom present on your carbonyl, this could be ester, acid chloride, other things like that, that will tend to show up right around 175. And then your ketone and aldehyde, those kind of carbonyls, they will tend to show up right at 200. And this is the entire list of everything that I had proposed for you to put on here. Why do this? Well, if you have these few things memorized, and there's really not that many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, depending on how you chunk them, at most 8 things, now you're ready to deal with any kind of new thing that I provide. Like, say, what if we have a nitrogen instead of an oxygen? How do you think that's going to change things? Is it going to change it much? And in which direction? Spoiler, of course it's going to shift things slightly down to the right. It's like an oxygen, except not quite. It's not quite as electronegative. So anyway, you can start making predictions and slotting other things in. Where would you put a chloride? Where would you put something that's relatively boring, but maybe not a methyl? So like a CH2 sort of thing. Well, that's going to show up, boring-ish, but maybe left of methyl. If you've got the touchstones, you can slot in a lot of other things. This is the context in which you need to operate. Memorize this, and you're golden for C13 NMR chemical shifts.